Hi, good morning. This is Emily Vardaman Walters with the Lipstick Pickup Podcast calling for Howard Daniel.
Well, you've got me. I'm Howard Daniel.
I'm
Nice to talk with you, Emily.
Nice to talk to you too. Again, I can't thank you enough for taking my call today, for picking up. You've been so helpful to my podcast and my exploits. We've had some great conversations about your father, Nat Daniel, and the history of the Danelectro Corporation over the last year or so, and this time we're going to record it.
Great.
I've learned so much from you, and I should have been keeping better notes, but this time we're going to have it for the record. And I hope to add this sort of approach to future episodes in my podcast where I just simply call somebody like you, 411 information. The best approach and one of the inspirations for my podcast is the power of the telephone. I'm calling Howard to introduce him to my listeners and give some service to some great work that he's done, keeping the world informed about his father, Nat Daniel, and the world of Danelectro. They can all be found on his website, which is www.pin4, the number 4, it's pinforrent.com. Which is how I met you. And then when I first started publishing the podcast, I heard from you, and we've had an occasional phone call ever since, and this one we're going to record. Howard is in the business content writing and editing business, and his website, it's a great summary of your professional services, but it's also got a blog that is a great read for anybody who likes somebody as interesting and well-traveled as Mr. Howard Daniel. I think one of the first times I really started to appreciate your father Nat as a personality is reading your writings about him on your website. And also the introduction to the book that I have, know and love, and am eagerly anticipating a greatly expanded and revised edition of the book Neptune Bound. And to you, your original intro, because there's a new book coming out and you've got a new intro. You've got lots of new information that has been clarified, discovered since the first publication of that book. So I want to just talk about the old book and tell our listeners, most of them already anticipating this book, by the way. I am grateful. This is your words, Mr. Daniel. I am grateful to Doug Tulloch, who, out of admiration for the originality and quality of Danelectro guitars and amplifiers, has spent over a decade of his life and a great deal of his resources in creating Neptune Bound, which he has called, quote, a labor of love, unquote. It is no doubt the most comprehensive, authoritative book on the subject written to date. I am also grateful for Doug's invitation to write this introduction. The best way to do this, I realized, was to compose the tribute that follows to the man who created Danelectro, my father, Nathan I. Daniel. That was the start of your introduction in the 2007 book. So,
yes.
We don't want to divulge. There's a lot of ahas and additional information, and we're not going to give away any of them today. We're going to talk about things that already need a lot more awareness in the history of the Danelectro stories, and that's what we're going to do.
Great.
And at the end, I'm going to give a quick teaser. At the end, I'm going to have Howard explain to me what he knows and what he does not know about why they called them lipstick pickups and where the idea came from. But we're going to save that to the very end. I'm going to take it from the top. And one of the talking points that I admire and remember about this, because it is very much accurate about your father, was, quote, he was devoid of interest in fame or publicity, unquote. Tell my listeners about this aspect of your father's life.
Well, he never, obviously I grew up with him, and I had occasion to remain in touch with him throughout the rest of his life. He passed away at the end of 1994. And it was obvious to me he was just not interested in fame. He was in the business of thinking about a lot of things, but in particular thinking about problems in the physical world. And one of the first problems that he set himself to solving was how to make a better amplifier. And this is way back when he was barely 20 years old in the early 1930s. And he came up with a revolutionary design for an amplifier. But I don't want to get into that. But what I can tell you to respond to your question about fame is that I left home when I went off to college, and then after college and grad school, I went overseas and worked first in the Peace Corps and then in the U.S. Foreign Service, meaning at American embassies and consulates overseas. But I came back home and decided to work with him on a project that he was then engaged in, and which was developing an ocean-going vessel, a boat, that could go fast and do it very smoothly in rough water and inexpensively. And that was after he had left New Jersey, where I was born and grew up, and where he spent most of his life. And he had gone to Hawaii after my mother passed away. There was nothing more to keep him on the East Coast, really, and he didn't like the weather. It made him feel uncomfortable whenever in the wintertime he would get a cold and couldn't shake it until the warm weather came around again in the spring. So we went to Hawaii in search of a wonderful climate, and he found it there, of course. And that's when he invented this boat, and I started working with him. And one of the things that I found when I worked with him was that on that boat project, in beginning to try to get some publicity for his boat idea, we were in touch with people in the media, and a couple of the people we were in touch with, one of them a radio broadcaster, the other a cameraman for TV, were themselves guitarists, and they knew about Danelectro, and they loved it, and they were quite aware of the great number of innovations that my father had brought to the industry. And so he was flabbergasted that people even knew who he was, and that there were, so to speak, Danelectro fans out there in the world at large. And he found them, basically 5,000 miles away from New Jersey, where he had made these guitars and amplifiers.
Do you think one thing we talked about? I want to ask you. Your dad was generally unaware, not of rock and roll. He was not a person that listened to rock and roll. Do you think that's one reason why he was surprised at how the notoriety of the Danelectro, because he was sort of not really involved in rock?
I wouldn't say that was it. He was in the business of designing and manufacturing amplifiers and then guitars from when he was a young guy in the early 1930s until he sold the business to MCA in 1966, I believe it was, or 67. And then just a couple of years later, when the entire guitar business took a nosedive, Danelectro, which went out of business when MCA, which had bought it several years earlier, realized that business was not very good, and that they just decided to liquidate their investment. So they closed the thing down. Um, it was not just that he was not following rock; he was not following the industry anymore. He completely moved on. He went to Hawaii. He enjoyed the place. He enjoyed the weather. He enjoyed the scenery and the water, and he saw something that really grabbed his attention as an innovator, which was that there were no boats. If you wanted to travel from one island to another in this archipelago, in which the major islands where most people lived were roughly, most of them, about 100 miles from each other, you had to fly. You couldn't take a ferry because there were no ferries. And the reason there were no ferries is that the water is rough.
Yeah.
It looks beautiful, but it's rough. And so he started to think about what sort of a vessel would it take to provide fast, inexpensive, and smooth riding transportation between the islands. He applied his knowledge of physics to this problem, and he realized that there was no boat at that point in existence that combined all three of those characteristics, namely speed, low cost to build and operate, and a smooth ride in rough water.
Yeah.
And so he started thinking about that, just as he had thought about various electronic problems in developing his first revolutionary amplifiers back in the early 1930s.
Yeah.
And, he was well equipped to do that. He had a very lively, innovative mind.
To my next point, your quote, the essence of the Danelectro story is Nat Daniel's lifetime of innovation. I'm going to get you to talk about materials and things like that. Anything else you want to expand on his time in Hawaii? Was it in Honolulu where he lived? Is that right?
Yes, it was in Honolulu. And, on the broader question that you asked about his lifetime of innovation, it began when he was a very young man and got interested in electronics. As I wrote in the introduction to Doug Tulloch's book, a version of which, almost identical, is on my website that you mentioned earlier in this discussion. He was probably the first kid on his block, or certainly in his neighborhood, to build a crystal radio set. And I suspect a lot of listeners today in 2025 have no idea what a crystal radio set was. But in those early days, you could put a few things together by hand and be able to pick up radio broadcasts. And he did it as a kid. I would guess he was probably in his early teens when he did this. And then he started thinking about circuitry and applied himself in particular to a way to make an amplifier which didn't exist at that point, an amplifier that could amplify sounds from the lowest lows to the highest highs within the range of human hearing. Before that, what amplifiers existed were able to amplify signals at different frequencies, some frequencies better than others. And so amplification might not have been so good in the high range or in the low range. But he figured out a way to get uniform amplification throughout the human range of hearing. That is the range of human hearing from the lowest lows to the highest highs. And that was a revolutionary breakthrough. And by the way, he never patented it because, as he explained to me and anybody else who was interested, he couldn't afford a patent attorney. So he did it, and he incorporated it into amplifiers and certainly into every amplifier he ever built. But lots of other people were doing the same thing later because it was not a patent. It was not protected by a patent.
That's...
and let me just, if I might go back.
Sure.
And so that was, and perhaps the earliest example of his innovativeness. And the latest example of his innovativeness was after his Danelectro business was sold by MCA, which had bought it in the mid-60s, and he retired and went to Hawaii, where the weather was a lot nicer than on the East Coast, and applied himself to the problem of why is there no ferry between the islands, and then realized why there wasn't, because there was no boat that could compete with airlines in terms of relatively low cost, making the journey from one island to another quick enough to compete with an airline, and give a ride that was smooth enough so that people wouldn't be seasick in rough ocean water.
Mm-hmm.
And he came up with a concept that met all three of those criteria. It was fast, it was inexpensive to build and inexpensive to operate, and it gave a smooth ride in rough water. No other boat in existence, even today, does that. And I worked with him on trying to get it commercialized, and unfortunately, we did not succeed. And the patents he got on that boat have long since expired.
There are wonderful photographs of what Howard is explaining to me in this in Neptune Bound. Do you have those photographs on your website? I'm sorry. Do you have the photographs of the outrigger, the super outrigger, on your website?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
It's
It's in one of my blog posts, and I would have to think about. I don't think I want to interrupt this phone call and go
yeah.
looking for it.
To,
But I would say that anybody who gets to the website, and I believe the title of the piece that I wrote about it. I wrote about it in a couple of places, but there was one that was one piece that I wrote that explains it in quite some detail.
yeah.
And I think quite clearly, with photographs to go with it, is titled, or something very close to this title, Nat Daniel's Final Invention.
Ah, okay.
But if anybody gets to the website and uses the search, the little magnifying glass that indicates you can search for something on the website, and simply types in the words, or the one word, it's written as though it were one word, super outrigger,
Okay.
S-U-P-E-R, outrigger, that will come up.
It's a well-organized website. I've spent time on it, and you're right, it is easy to find things you've written. I counted your blog post or essays under the subject of Danelectro. You had 16 there and a bunch of essays on your father, so there's a lot of great information in there. Your dad was a real innovator, and not all of them make it up in the air, as we well know, but but it was a fabulous idea. Did he travel between the islands, or was he just looking at the possibility of just, it's sort of a civic nature to think about how travel could be improved, accessibility could be improved, which brings me to my next point. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this on the record. I told you in some of our conversations that my dad also made an effort for the war. He was a combat veteran. But one reason why I love reading his letters is that he was a specialist, and he was in awe of all the jobs that were being done that and helped the war effort, from rationing to everything. And your father, I'm going to quote you exactly, during World War II, Nat Daniels served as a civilian designer for the U.S. Army Signal Corps in Fort Monmouth. Did I pronounce it right this time? Monmouth, New Jersey. I went and looked up the Signal Corps and how important it was to the war effort. One of the big things was the Signal Corps laboratory, and what your father did for them must have been very important. Will you tell me a little bit about that for the record, on the record?
Sure. Well, the main thing he did, his main contribution, was to find a way uh, to shield the workings of Jeeps and motorcycles, or not simply Jeeps, but gasoline powered gasoline powered vehicles like trucks, Jeeps, what have you,
Mm-hmm.
and motorcycles. Um, when an engine of that type uh, is running, it emits electrical uh, uh, radio waves, in effect, electrical signals that can be picked up. And it just makes, if anybody is trying to communicate with each other through a walkie-talkie, for example, on the battlefield, and somebody in the trench on the front line communicating with battalion headquarters a little bit further back from the front line uh, to get or receive orders or something that could save the day or lose lives if it didn't get through. If somebody if a messenger maybe came roaring up on a motorcycle,
Mm-hmm.
that would drown out the communication because there would be a lot of interference. So the Army was looking for an inexpensive way to keep this kind of interference from being emitted by gasoline-powered engines that would be used in the war. And my dad set his mind to finding it, and that's what he did. They said not only did he do it sitting there at his workbench at Fort Monmouth, but they, after he came up with the idea, they sent him off to Jeep manufacturers and motorcycle manufacturers. He went to the places where they manufacture Jeeps in the Detroit area, and I believe there was, I want to say in Massachusetts, Indian motorcycles. Anyhow, he traveled and worked with these manufacturers of vehicles to make sure that what they produced and was shipped off to the Army would not interfere with radio communications on the battlefield.
Wow.
And there
Critical.
were other ways of doing it than the way he came up with. But he was asked to do it in a way that would save money and save vital raw materials that might have been used to do this in a more expensive way. And he did that. And at one point when I was a kid, I asked him about the work that he did as working for the Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth during the war. And he said, I saved the government $1 million. And I don't know whether it was really actually $1 million, but he saved them a lot of money, and he probably, because he helped eliminate this kind of interference with battlefield communications, he probably saved an untold number of lives.
I agree with you
It was really a big
completely.
contribution.
I agree with you completely. And I have reason to say this because I have access to my war letters, and my father made the march all the way from Omaha Beach to Potsdam Conference. He's constantly talking about communications. They were critical. He was in the hell on wheel. I don't know much about military history, but it was critical, and he talks about it. Radio connections. His Silver Star was awarded for forward observance. He radioed things back. And not to get into my father, but I get it, Howard. I totally get you saying he saved lives. I can tell you that I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
He might have saved my father's life.
Well, who knows? Yeah, it would be nice if he had. But I was going to say,
Those things are so important. Yeah.
during war, clear communications is critical, absolutely critical,
Yeah.
and he was able to help there. So I'm proud of him for that.
Amazing. And he started making amplifiers in the 30s, and then he has to take all of that offline and contribute to the war effort. But it was in concert with his skill set and his innovation, though, and that's why I
Oh
think
yes.
it's such an interesting part of the story. Okay, next quote, and this is one thing when I proselytize and get evangelical with people about the Danelectro story is it is a short one. And you have a quote in your essay, 1949 to 1969. The Danelectro years were marked by a series of innovations. Let's talk. Thanks to your father, not Daniel.
Well, I'm not looking at it right now. I'm just sitting here quietly, so I'm going to reach back in my mind. But probably the most important innovation he made was that revolutionary amplifier circuit that got him into the business in the first place back in the early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, there were some other noteworthy innovations. Uh, Perhaps the single most important or best known one by people who are interested in music and guitars, in particular popular music, was his innovation in creating an electric sitar. The sitar is a classical Indian instrument which looks nothing like a guitar, and which produces a very distinctive sound, which I hate to encapsulate it in one word, but I'll use the word twangy. It's so much more than that, but it's got an interesting sound. Let's just put it that way. And it became popular in Western pop music, rock and roll, because the Beatles, back in the 60s, went to India at one point, and they spent some time, and among other things, they spent time with Ravi Shankar, who was a well-known Indian player of the sitar, the real sitar, the classical instrument that they use in India. And one or more of these four guys, the Beatles, learned to play it well enough that it was used in some of their recordings. And it's a cool sound. It's a great sound.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad used to collaborate with a guitarist, a very innovative musician by the name of Vinnie Bell. And they would talk about a lot of things, and it was very helpful to my dad to be talking with a musician who used the guitars and amplifiers that he was making about things that would be of interest to people who played these instruments. And at one point, Vinny said to Dad, "Boy, wouldn't it be interesting? Wouldn't it be cool if you could get the sitar sound out of a guitar that somebody could just pick up, and who knows how to play the guitar, and pick up this other instrument that looks like a guitar kind of, but sounds like a sitar." And that started my dad to thinking about how to do it. So they examined. My dad examined a real sitar, one from India, and he found out what the secret was to the sound. And the secret had to do with the shape of the bridge. The bridge is the piece of the guitar that the strings rest on at the lower end, meaning the end closest to where you pluck the strings, as opposed to the other end at the top of the neck, called the head of the guitar,
Mm-hmm.
where the strings start out their journey down to the bridge. And the bridge of a sitar is quite different from the bridge of a guitar. And it produces a kind of a buzzy sound that is very, it's what makes the sitar sound like it does. And my dad isolated the essence of the problem. He saw it and went to work, and they figured out how to make such a bridge for a guitar. And he did a few other things, and that would enable a guitar player to go ahead and just pick up the instrument, an electric sitar of the kind that my dad made, and play it like it was a guitar, and any tune he wanted, and it would sound like a sitar and not like a guitar.
Yeah.
So
You're,
that was his most recent innovation in the field of guitars. But he was also they called it the Belzuki because it looked sort of like the classical Greek stringed instrument called the bouzouki, B-O-U-Z, instead of Belzuki. And the Belzuki, my dad gave the Belzuki its name because, again, he got the idea to try to make something like that from his friend Vinnie Bell. This all took place way back, I think it was in the early 60s, when there was a movie came out. It was called Never on Sunday. It was made in Greece, and it throughout the soundtrack of this movie, there was Greek music, and it was played on bouzouki. And bouzouki is the actual bouzouki is an instrument that is double stringed. That is just like a guitar normally has 6 strings. Well, a 12-string guitar has 12 strings, which is 6 pairs of 2 strings.
mm-hmm.
And when you play it, because of the way the strings vibrate, just a little, not quite perfectly in tune with each other, you get a sort of a tiny sound. And that is the sound of the bouzouki. So they figured out, we could make something that sounds kind of like a bouzouki, but again, any guitar player can pick it up and play it because it's like a guitar. It's got 6 pairs of 6 pairs of double stringed, 6 pairs of strings, 6 pairs of 2 strings, and sounds great. And the body of it, you can make the body any shape you like. So they made it in the same teardrop shape as the actual Greek bouzouki, and they called it the Belzuki because my dad's friend Vinnie Bell gave him the idea to do it.
It's so perfect. We are on an audio call, but it's so perfect that my set here, and it'll be a video, it over me is the Vinnie Bell electric sitar, and on the other side of me is a Belzuki. So as you were explaining what these instruments are, I'm pointing them out. I have them on my wall. And I can't thank you enough for explaining the origins of it because this is another thing I love getting on the record from you. You also confirmed what most people generally or should know is that Danelectro produced the first electric 12 string.
That's right.
And I don't play guitar, as you well know, and you don't either. That's why we can talk about these things, without getting mired in too much because we don't play. But
If I
one,
can interrupt for a moment, I was going
yeah,
to say my dad couldn't play the guitar either,
yes,
but he knew how to make them.
he sounds like a bit of an acoustical genius too, for him to be able to sit back and look at those things and figure out the buzz bridge, as we call it. It is what gives that sitar its buzzy, resonant sound, and it was a stroke of genius. Most guitarists who really understand these instruments say that the reason why, as wonderful as the lipstick pickup tubes are, and they are integral to the sound, it's really about that buzz bridge.
Yeah, well, the buzz bridge is only on the sitar, not on any of the guitars.
Oh, yes, I meant the sitar,
Yeah.
but another thing that I like to let people know is that it was the Belzuki. The Belzuki has the wood bridge, the rosewood bridge that people love. By the way, they love that bridge. The rosewood bridge is beloved by the Danelectro community. But the Belzuki, you were the person that made me understand the cultural phenomenon of Never on Sunday, and I could not find it streaming online, so I got on YouTube and watched it one day.
Oh, cool! I haven't seen it since I was probably a teenager.
It's
I I was probably still in high school at the time.
It won an Oscar. That soundtrack or the music won an Oscar, or the movie
Oh
won an
yeah.
Oscar. That was an era in which foreign films catching fire, internationally influenced tastes.
Yeah.
When you think about France and Italy and all these filmmakers, and that one, when you look at it, you can understand why everybody wanted to look or sound Greek.
Well, I
It's-
was going to say that the bouzouki sound is wonderful, and the
yeah,
music, the particular tunes that were playing in that film,
yeah,
were great. It no wonder it caught fire and won an Oscar. It
yeah.
deserved it.
It's thank you for talking about that because it's just another dot that I like to connect your father and Vinnie Bell together as a collaboration. These instruments are so influential and they're so important on the timeline of music, recorded music. And I think Vinnie Bell used that Belzuki and sitar a lot more than you can even find credits for. And I continue to find things, and I've told you that I can find those instruments used a lot here in Nashville, the Belzuki
Oh
and
yeah,
the
absolutely.
electric
Well,
sitar.
one of the other innovations that my dad came up with was a six-string bass. Normally, the original bass, which is the big, huge instrument that you see being played with a bow, usually in an orchestra, which is as tall basically as most people, or taller than many people.
Mm-hmm.
The When people started making electric basses, which are in the shape of a guitar but with usually a longer neck, and tuned in such a way as to give those low tones the same as the classical bass. Um, it was also four strings, just like the classical instrument that is used in orchestras. Four strings. And my dad thought to himself at a certain point, well, why not just use, give and put two extra strings on it, so that with a six-stringed instrument, a bass player can go ahead and play all the bass notes he wants. But if he is feeling creative, he can use those upper two strings, the new strings that my dad added to the four-string bass to make the six-string bass. He can play into the guitar range on the same instrument.
Genius.
And so he pioneered the six-string bass. That's just another one of his example of his innovativeness. And I believe the six-string bass has been very influential in the tic-tac sound that they get in Nashville.
Ground Zero.
Yep, that is
Har-
Ground Zero.
Harold Bradley. He invented that vibe, that groove, and
And he
we
played it on a Danelectro six-string bass.
yeah, more. One thing that you explained to me, or I got a nice letter from your son Adam. He sent some, not fan mail, but a great letter. Maybe you told me the joke. We promised to keep this a clean show, but what did TS stand for? It stood for totally shielded. But your dad had a joke about something else about what it stood for.
Yeah, well, and totally shielded, the first letters of those two words are TS. And sometimes, at least when I was a kid, if you said, well, TS, that meant, in effect, too bad. It's a nice way of saying, if you don't mind my using a four-letter word, tough shit. Um, and it was too bad for my dad's competitors, other manufacturers of guitars and amplifiers, who did not shield the electronics in their products.
Mm-hmm.
My dad began shielding everything so that if somebody was playing a guitar in, let's say, a nightclub where there were neon signs around, neon signs, just like gasoline engines, emit electrical signals, so that if you were to play an unshielded guitar in a place that had some neon signs in it, like ever so many bars and cocktail lounges and nightclubs and so on, if you were to play an instrument that was not shielded in such a place, the sound would be distorted by the electronic interference from the neon.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad thought about this, and he figured out a simple and inexpensive way to shield all the electronics in all his guitars and all the amplifiers he made. And he referred to this as total shielding. And because none of his competitors were doing it, he thought it was TS for them. And the classic,
I love it.
when he introduced this, he introduced, and he never went back to unshielded products. When he introduced his line of totally shielded guitars and amplifiers, he did it at the music industry's annual convention and product show called National Association of Music Merchants, NAMM, which would hold a convention and a show in those days once a year.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a booth, well, not a booth, a room there in the hotel where this was being done, and Vinny, my dad's friend and excellent guitarist, was demonstrating Danelectro stuff, and so all the stuff that my dad was exhibiting at this show was totally shielded, except for one thing that he made without the shielding deliberately. He called it Brand X, and it was a guitar that was not shielded.
Mm.
And they also created a little device that had a neon light in it.
Hmm.
And Vinny would play the Danelectro instruments next to this neon light, and they sounded great. You couldn't hear any noise at all no interference from the neon. But when he plugged in the Brand X that my dad had made, which was in its electronics similar to basically what everybody else was offering, which was not shielded,
Mm-hmm.
then it sounded terrible because it was influenced by the interference emitted by this neon.
Hmm.
And so the difference between a new Danelectro that was totally shielded and Brand X, which basically represented everybody else's products, everybody else's guitars, was enormous. So that's why Dad said it was TS for his competitors.
I like his style tremendously.
He had a good sense of humor.
I can tell. I can tell. And the photograph, some of the photographs that I really love of your father. I love how you talk about him feeling a lot better physically after moving to Hawaii. Getting out of the cold climate because he looks very happy in many of those photographs.
Oh, yes, no question about it. Yeah, and you can say, well, there's one photograph I'm thinking of that you may have seen when you looked over some of the posts on my website. It was probably a birthday party for one of the kids, or who knows, maybe even for him. But he put a couple of, I don't know what you call it, when you open a champagne bottle, uh, before it's opened, you have to loosen sort of a
Like the wire
wire
cage, yeah.
Yeah, so he put a couple. He stuck a couple of those into his eye sockets so that it looked like he was wearing some kind of strange monocles. And he had a great sense of humor. He was a great raconteur. He told a lot of good jokes.
Yeah, I love it. The total shielding thing was a real source of pride for Danelectro because I noticed that on some of the original instruments that I have inspected, the guitars, which are the things that I know mostly about, they have the sticker right there on the headstock and it says totally shielded.
That's right.
And I like it because, I don't know if you know this, but some guitarists call guitars axes. Do you know that?
Oh yes.
And I've been telling people, no, it's a shield. It's a shield.
Okay.
Totally shielded with Nat Daniel.
It's a shielded axe.
It's a.
Talking with Vinny and other guitarists that he
Hmm.
would talk with about how when they went to perform in a club, where there was neon signage around the establishment.
Mm.
That neon screwed up their sound
Yeah.
because it was coming from an unshielded instrument, unshielded amplifiers.
Mm-hmm.
So he figured out an inexpensive way to wrap everything in metallic. What he used was a type of paper that is used in construction. I think electricians use it
Mm-hmm.
in the construction of new buildings.
Mm-hmm.
It's got copper foil on one side and a very heavy duty stiff paper on the other, and but it's not so stiff that you can't bend it. And so he simply used that kind of material. Think of something as stiff as, for example, sandpaper.
Yeah.
But he used that kind of material to bend around and totally envelop the electronics inside a guitar. And also to shield the electronics of his amplifiers.
Solved
So
a
that they
problem.
were, yeah, solved the problem just like that. It was
Problem
something that was
solver.
available. That's the kind of material you could get at basically at a hardware store.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it's not very expensive, and it lends itself to the purpose quite nicely.
My house was built in 1947, and I've made some updates, but I've tried to leave some things the way they are, including some light fixtures. And when my electrician pops into some of these things, I see that paper. I know what
Oh
you're.
yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. Who knows what it's called? This is.
Yeah, I don't know what it's called either, but it's stiff and it's got copper on one side and heavy paper on the other.
Yeah. This is rolling right in perfectly for the next thing I want to talk about, which we're going to lead into our big teaser about lipstick pickups. I want to talk to you about rigid control of expense and your dad's resourcefulness in selecting materials like masonite and homasote. And I want to remind the listener, although I know you remember, when we talked over a year ago, the reason why this jives with my own personal history is that my father was a pioneering forester, well above his time, who worked for masonite. In after the war, these things are ramping up and they're being used in building products and all kinds of things, movie sets. And your father, for one reason or another, selected that material. Most people now credit it with the masonite ones having a very unique tone. Derided at the time, I think, to quote you, masonite and homasote. So I would like to talk to you about quote unquote rigid control of expense and your dad's discipline about cost control not meaning making it a cheap guitar.
Sure. Well, first of all, the quote that you just used about rigid control of expense was not something that my dad used. That appears in the tribute that I wrote to my dad, what you called the essay,
Mm-hmm.
which appears as the introduction to Doug Tulloch's book, Neptune Bound,
Mm-hmm.
and also on my website. Um, that quote comes from the buyer of musical instruments at Sears Roebuck.
Ah.
Sears was the place that probably accounted there's no question, accounted for the great bulk of the guitars and amplifiers that my dad manufactured and sold. He sold them to Sears, and Sears sold them to the public, not under the Danelectro name, but under its own brand name, Silvertone.
Mm-hmm.
And the buyer, well, there were several buyers for the musical instrument department at Sears over the years. But my dad, Sears started buying things from my dad not long after he went into business for himself after World War II, when he founded the Danelectro Corporation in 1947. And Sears was looking for a particular well, they were looking for a way to amplify the sound of accordions, of all things. And they wanted to be able to insert a pickup inside an accordion without drilling a hole in the accordion. And nobody could figure it out. And somebody who knew the buyer for Sears at that time, the musical instrument buyer for Sears, and who knew my dad, suggested that the Sears people ought to talk to my dad, and they did. And my dad figured out a simple way to get a pickup inside an accordion without drilling a hole in the accordion. And that started Sears then purchasing one of my dad's amplifier models and selling it as Silvertone. And originally it was to amplify accordion music, but as accordions faded in popularity and guitars grew in popularity, you know, an amplifier can amplify anything any kind of musical note that you put through it. And so these became known as guitar amplifiers, and so they were. And that started an association of about 2 decades in which my dad was the sole supplier of amplifiers to Sears Roebuck, which made him probably the single biggest manufacturer of amplifiers in the world at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about rigid control of cost. So the buyer, a later buyer of Sears, because every so often people would rotate in and out of this job at Sears, and whenever there was a new buyer for musical instruments and musical instrument amplifiers, Dad, I think, would be a little concerned. Well, would the new guy like to continue to purchase these things from him, or maybe try to find a new source for guitars and amplifiers?
Yeah.
Never happened. They always stuck with him. The new guy would come in and buy Dad's and continue buying Dad's stuff because it was good and it was low cost.
Yeah.
And so one of these guys is quoted. It was quoted in an article that I'll name them. There are 2 guys who are in the music business. One of them is an electronics guy and as well as a guitar player by the name of Steve Sost, and the other is a writer by the name of Jim Washburn. And Jim Washburn and Steve Sost collaborated way back in the early 80s, 1983. They wanted to get an interview with my dad. They were going to be in Hawaii anyhow, and they had heard that after Danelectro closed down and my dad's leaving the business, that he had wound up in Hawaii. So, and they were going to be in Hawaii, or maybe just one of them was going to be in Hawaii. Anyhow, they looked him up in the phone book in Honolulu, and they found him. And they did an interview. And of all the many things that have been written about Danelectro, other than the things that I've written, of all the many things that people have written about Danelectro and about my father, not one, except for the article that Steve and Jim wrote, came from an interview with my father. All the rest of it is based on secondary sources, or what I would like to call hearsay. And a lot of which is baloney. It's just not factual, but myths get born and they have a life, they take on a life of their own. Anyhow, Steve and Jim wrote this article about my dad and Danelectro, and it was a very, very good one. And in it, they managed to contact this, by the time they wrote it, he was retired from Sears. His name was Joe Fisher. And Joe Fisher had some nice things to say about my dad. And one of them was this quote that you just gave about my dad's way of wanting to establish rigid control of costs. Mm-hmm. Because the most important thing about my dad's work and his innovations, if you were to wrap it up in one phrase, is that he was able to, and I I'm sure that this is in the tribute that I wrote to him, what you call the essay, the introduction to Doug Tollick's book.
Yes.
In the tribute that I wrote to him, what I said was the essence of his innovativeness was that he managed to create high quality instruments at low cost. And he did it, and that's what Joe Fisher called rigid control of costs. But he did it in any number of ways. But the most significant, I think, part of it was finding inexpensive materials to use. For example, you had mentioned masonite, in which your dad played a considerable role. But also and that was used as the front and the back of the body of all his guitars. And another material called homosote, which he used as the main component of the cabinets of his amplifiers. When he first began manufacturing amplifiers under the Danelectro brand in 1947, he used plywood, I believe, for those first few amplifiers. And then there was some kind of a strike which made it impossible to get plywood, and he wanted to continue to produce amplifiers. So he looked around for some other substance, some other kind of material that might work, and he found it in something called homosote, which is produced by a manufacturer in New Jersey out of recycled newspaper. And it is a type of very thick, sturdy, it's a thick, sturdy composite, which some people deride it as cardboard, but it's not cardboard. And he used it as the for the cabinets of all the amplifiers he ever produced after those first two. And it worked just fine. And one of his competitors, an outfit by the name of K, which also produced guitars, a competitor to Danelectro, used to make fun of Danelectro amplifiers using homosote for their cases. And guess what? Eventually, K started using homosote too. So my dad had his sweet revenge.
Yeah.
And learning about that.
These products were revolutionary at the time. And the first time I looked up or saw the word homosote, I saw it described as a wallboard, and I assumed it was similar to masonite. It's not. It's cellulose. It's recycled newspapers. And this morning I went to just quickly look up the history of it, and it's also an English idea that adopted in the United States, and it was a genius idea. Well,
my dad would have been attracted to a good idea like that.
yeah.
But if I can return to something, I'll let myself get off track. The biggest innovation he made was figuring out a range of different ways, manufacturing techniques, and raw materials to use instead of something more expensive, that would allow him to create something that worked really well, high quality, but at a low cost. And in terms of the guitars, as opposed to the amplifiers, it was something that would enable a beginner, a youngster, a person who maybe wasn't even 10 years old, certainly somebody with tender fingers, because when you learn to play the guitar, you have to develop calluses at your fingertips to be able to press down the strings to get the different notes you want and the different chords. So he wanted to create something that even a beginner and the parents of a young beginner could afford to buy without having to shell out a lot of money to buy an instrument that was high priced.
Yeah.
And so he was always thinking about ways to do things, and a lot of it had to do with ways that he found to steps in the manufacturing process that were easy to do. One of the things, if you think about stringed instruments, one of the things that comes to mind, of course, is a violin.
Mm-hmm.
And the best known violins were created in the 1600s by an Italian violin maker named Stradivarius. And today, Stradivarius violins are still being played. They were manufactured all those hundreds of years ago by this wonderful craftsman, the sound of whose instruments nobody can reproduce even today.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the finest guitars and the highest cost guitars are also made by craftsmen, by people. The term for people who hand make guitars is they are luthiers,
Mm-hmm.
Luthier,
Mm-hmm.
derived from the same word that you have the ancient, very old-fashioned plucked instrument called a lute, Lute.
Oh, okay.
Anyhow, my dad did not employ any luthiers. He employed people you could find on the street and who were looking for a job. And the big secret to his manufacturing process, and I witnessed it as somebody who used to work summers in the factory
Yeah.
in my high school and college years, was that if you use hand tools, a screwdriver, a soldering iron, a hammer, if you could use these tools, you could make the amplifiers, that is the amplifier cases, the soldering iron. You could wire together all the different components of the circuitry needed, and all the capacitors and resistors and so on, and vacuum tubes that would go into the chassis of an amplifier.
Mm-hmm.
And he would hire people with no experience and show them how to do their job, and if they and all the specific elements of the job were pretty simple. If you could use a screwdriver, for example, and if you were a good worker, you were hired, and he kept you on, and he gave you raises real fast. And if you were not a good worker, if you didn't show up on time, if you were clumsy or whatever, then you didn't get a chance to continue with the company. He would let you go. And so he manufactured all these high quality instruments and amplifiers out of inexpensive components using the help of ordinary people who would respond to a want ad in the newspaper, people who were looking for a job of some kind, and he did not have to pay them like you would pay Mr. Stradivarius to make your violin.
Yeah.
Or a luthier who would painstakingly assemble an entire guitar out of raw materials, carving the wood, shaving it, and being highly meticulous in the work that he did by virtue of his understanding and craftsmanship. I know. My dad's products were made by ordinary people using ordinary tools.
Yeah.
And some of the tools or some of the machines that were used in the factory were machines that my dad designed to accomplish stuff that they had not originally been designed to do, but which he got them to do with a little ingenuity, to be able to sand, for example, to sand things down without wearing through sandpaper quite so quickly as you might otherwise do. I'd save a little money. He was always looking for ways to make things good but inexpensively.
Yeah, it's one of the secrets at Danelectro. They weren't cheap instruments. And I love that you use the that people joke and called it cardboard about homicide or masonite. I've heard people call them cardboard guitars, and sometimes they're joking, but there is this perception. And I understand what they did there. They were making attainably priced, high quality instruments with very ingenious materials, thanks to your father.
Materials, and not only materials, but also thinking in the way they were manufactured.
Yeah.
And they were put together. In the tribute that I wrote to him, I described a machine that he developed, which was used to finish off the fingerboards of guitar necks. And basically, he built it from scratch, and it enabled him to use this machine to do a whole batch of guitar necks at a single time. All an employee of the company needed to do was to clip a bunch of unfinished necks onto this rotating machine and come back about an hour later and take them off, and they were ready to go. And by the way, the material he used for the fingerboard was rosewood, which is not a cheap material. It was quite an expensive material, but very high quality and the appropriate kind of material to use. And where you couldn't get away with using, for example, you would never make a fingerboard out of plywood. He made it out of rosewood.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Oh, perfect summary. And you know, I want to thank you for taking the time. And now I'm going to get into the teaser. What I really wanted to get on the record from Mr. Howard Daniel. In the 4 years that I've been working on this, almost 5, I go into guitar shops. I've talked to people about the history of Danelectro, and the name of my podcast is called The Lipstick Pickup. I thought it was a clever name, a clever idea. And people say, do you know why they're called lipstick pickups? And I always say yes, that I'm aware that they did use lipstick tubes, but that's when the story gets murky. And what did you say just a minute ago? You said things get relayed and stories get more, inaccurate as they go along. I've heard all kinds of things where they described your dad stumbling into a surplus of lipstick tubes. I've heard versions where he walks into an old factory and there's a box sitting there. They were lipstick tubes, but those versions of the story are more elaborate than we know because we don't totally know why he used them, but we know what we know and we know what we don't know. I can't talk to Nat Daniel. I would love to get it out of the horse's mouth, but the best thing I can do right now in 2025 is to talk to the horse's son who worked at the factory. Huh? Yeah, the cultish son of Nat Daniel, Howard Daniel. Howard Daniel, please tell me and my listeners what you know and do not know about the choice of lipstick tubes.
Well, what I can say is that the most common thing that I have seen about this is that they are in almost anything that I've seen written about my dad's guitars. That says anything about the pickups, they refer to the lipstick tube pickups, and they say that it originated because he found some surplus lipstick tubes. And all I can say is that is 100% baloney. There probably was never such a thing as surplus lipstick tubes. And the story that you have heard, I'd never heard it before, but I've seen the surplus story in print many times, probably dozens of times. The story you talk about having stumbled across a box full of unused lipstick tubes, that's also baloney. My dad realized that it would look cool, and it would work very well in terms of the electronics of the pickup to encase the magnet and the wire coiled around the magnet, or the wire wound around the magnet that is the heart of the pickup, to encase it in a pair of lipstick tubes, one at each end. And where did he get them? He found a manufacturer of actual tubes for lipstick. It was located on Long Island in New York State. And this guy would make lipstick tubes for who knows how many cosmetics manufacturers. My dad looked up and found such a manufacturer on Long Island, and he contracted to buy lipstick tubes. And that's where he That's where he got his lipstick tubes. They were not surplus. They were not something he found in a box. He decided that those would be just the right sort of thing to use to encase the pickup. And he found somebody who manufactured them, and he bought them. It's that simple.
Perfect. He selected them because he was a manufacturing genius and very innovative, which is why he used something called masonite that was used in building products. He used it on the guitar. I know what he did there, which was it's a lot cheaper to buy something that's in mass production than to have it custom made or machined. And I think that's why I like getting the story straight on the record and relaying it to people is that it's not that the loosey-goosey, not accurate version of the story gives less credit to your father and his ingenuity. So
I would
that's
not even call it loosey-goosey. I would call it made up out of thin air and absolutely having no resemblance to fact. Total baloney.
yeah, I hear it all the time, and people will tell you things that are inaccurate with great confidence.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh, my dad used to make fun of people like that.
Oh, tell
My dad used to tell. He used to when he would caricature a person of that kind by saying by pretending to be such a person and that person would then ask his audience, well, do you know anything about subject X, Y, or Z? And when the person he was talking to said, no, I don't, then the person would say, oh, well, I'll tell you, as though he knew. But he didn't necessarily really know. And my dad always, he had met a lot of people who would be happy to tell you something that was entirely fictitious because he didn't know whether it was fictitious or not, but he thought he knew something. He knew you knew nothing. So my dad had very little use for people like that.
You are a delight. We're wrapping it up here. I want to tell you one of the wonderful quotes because this is right on time of yours. Nat Daniel was a conceptualizer, an innovator, an American original, just like the things he dreamed up, put together, and gave the world. Tough shit.
I stand by that quote. Perfectly true.
I'm so sorry that I did not ever get to meet him, but getting to know you over maybe a year and a half now has been as good because you are following in his footsteps in fine order, and you've been a great assistance to me, and we have the same interests in mind, awareness and accuracy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking with you, Emily. I am just uh, I am amazed and highly gratified to know of your interest in the work that my dad did. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye to our listeners right now. Thank you from Emily Vardaman Walters and Howard Daniel. Are you Santa Rosa? What is the name of the town you live in? Santa Rosa, California. It's beautiful there. Do you like the warmer climate just like your father?
Well, it's not as warm as Hawaii, but it's very nice.
Yeah.
It gets pretty. Actually, water can freeze at night on the coldest winter nights, but it melts during the day.
Yeah.
And but it's a generally quite a pleasant climate and a very lovely area.
And great bird watching.
Great bird watching, beautiful redwoods, gorgeous coastline. Much more interesting than the New Jersey coastline, which is flat and sandy.
Yeah.
Whereas the coastline here in the northern part of California and Oregon and Washington State is rugged with lots of boulders just offshore. Very, very interesting. Lovely place.
Yeah. Well, I cannot thank you enough for letting me call you in Santa Rosa, California today and you picking up. This is Emily Vardaman Walters with the Lipstick Pickup Podcast and Howard Daniel of Santa Rosa, California saying goodbye. Thank you very much.
You are entirely welcome, Emily. Goodbye.
Okay, we're done. I cannot thank you enough. I feel like I could have been a talent scout. You were so perfect.